Hello to all our listeners out there. We're starting another session, questions and answers, today, Friday, January 29th. And as I've been saying the last few times, each week it seems like the world's sure enough moving along at a rapid rate. COVID virus vaccinations are moving along. In fact, my wife and I will be getting vaccinated with our booster shot, our second shots tomorrow. But that's because I'm 75 and she's 76, so we qualified to be in that first group. And I certainly urge everybody to take all the precautions necessary and get vaccinated and be careful. It's a weird world out there, politically, economically, health-wise, etc. But guitars are still in demand. People want them, and that's a good thing. At least it's good for us, and I think it's good for all of you out there who are listening. But we certainly are looking forward, before this year is over, to being back to more normal times where people can go to concerts and go out and socialize without fear. At any rate, I'd like to start showing you something that we have a few left that I think is a great bargain for somebody out there who appreciates good acoustics. We have our Style 21 custom dreadnoughts. We originally had these available in 12 fret and 14 fret D and 14 fret quadruple O. And we've sold down to a very few left. The 14 fret D looks like this. This is one with Guatemalan rosewood back and sides, non-torrified Adirondack spruce top, and the same basic type ornamentation that a 21 would have had in the 1920s, which means that there were no D21s that actually were made that looked like this back then. They didn't make dreadnoughts in the 20s at Martin, other than for Ditson, but there were no Martin branded Style 21 dreadnoughts, not for Ditson or anybody else until the mid-1950s when the D21 was introduced. But if they had made a D21 in the 30s, it would look very much like this, with a couple of exceptions. I chose to use the inlay pattern that they had in the 1920s, which was just slotted diamond at 5th, 2 at 7th, 1 at 9th, and that's all on the fingerboard for the slotted diamonds. And then as per pre-war specs, this guitar has herringbone trim around the sound hole, which was 21 spec, and also the back stripe is herringbone. In the pre-1930s, the 21s had wood binding, and we chose to do figured koa wood binding. And then the black and white lines on the edge are actually wood violin purfling. There's no plastic on this guitar other than the nitrocellulose tortoiseshell grain pick guard. And the saddle and nut are bone. And this is a guitar that was done at the custom shop. So it's hide glue construction and has the steel T-bar, tempered steel T-bar in the neck, just like they did in the 30s. And this model was actually inspired by something I saw at the NAMM show in California in 2011. They had a model called the CS2111, CS custom shop, 21 style 21 ornamentation. The ornamentation was like this, with the exception that on that model they had Madagascar rosewood, not only for the back and sides and peghead veneer, but also for the bridge and fingerboard. And I saw those and was inspired, but I didn't really much care for the look of the rosewood fingerboard and bridge. And I decided to order some. Also, those had no pick guard. I wanted them with pick guard and with ebony board and ebony bridge, which is what a pre-World War II 21 would have had. And I ordered a rather large quantity of them. But then I also got the idea, gee, wouldn't it be nice to have some dreadnoughts that are 12 fret? And I asked if they could do those, and they said, yup, same price. And then I thought about it, and decided I'd like to get some 14 fret quadruple-O's, and we did that too. And I ordered a bunch at that show. And we continued doing those, which were doing very well for us until right about 3.5 years ago. We were selling them about $4,950. And then Martin decided they had underquoted the price and they really couldn't continue doing them at that amount. And the new wholesale would have been $6,125 dealer cost, and we didn't order any more, but we had a goodly stock, and we now are down to the very last few of them, but they're great guitars. And at any rate, they're on our list. We have one 14 fret D in Cocobolo back and sides, 3 with Guatemalan, 2 with Madagascar, and in 12 fret D, we have 2, both of which are Guatemalan rosewood. But these are extremely fine guitars. Now, the serial numbers on these will indicate that they're not brand new, but they are new old stock. They've never been sold, and they are still under warranty, and they're being offered the final closeout at the original price we had on them. So way less than it would cost to order one new, but they are the exact same quality as if you got an authentic series. And if anything, these actually would cost more to do, to build, than the new authentics, because the new authentics have ivoroid bindings. The koa wood binding is more expensive. And there's nothing about this guitar that is less expensive to do than the new D28 authentic, but they're selling right now for our old price. And I'll show you an example of the 12 fret D. And this is the 12 fret extended length body, same ornamentation as the other one, same construction, but solid peg head. The earliest 12 fret Ds had a slotted peg head, but by 33, they were doing some with a solid peg head just like this. So this essentially looks like if Martin had made a D21 in 1933, it would have looked like this. And these are great quality guitars at a price that we could not duplicate if we were to order them new today. They would be very much more, but they are unsold and new condition with full factory warranty. So anyway, that's the pitch for the day. I'll go on now to listener questions. Rob Mend has said, Gibson literature of the 1950s show a Rancher, which appears to be a non-cutaway Les Paul Jr. style guitar. Obviously not a production model, but do you know of any existing examples of a Rancher? The answer is I've never heard of one, never seen one, never found any Gibson literature that shows it. So if you have Gibson literature that shows a Rancher model, I'd sure like to see it. Gretsch offered a Rancher model during the 50s and actually onward for quite a while later. It was a acoustic guitar with a triangular sound hole, flat top. And typically Gibson would not want to use a model name that Gretsch was already using. So that seems a bit strange. But at any rate, if anybody knows about a Gibson Rancher, which I never heard of, by all means, let me know. But in the meantime, I'm dubious about the existence of such a guitar. The next question, Brian Ricker says, could you please shed some light on the Martin Custom 15 series from the late 70s to the early 90s? Well, that's a long period of time. It's a lot of changes from Martin. But Style 15 guitars feature a mahogany top, and the Style 15 has been around a long time. It was actually one of the models that was one of Martin's better sellers back in the 1950s, on into the 60s. They made single O and double O with mahogany top, back, and sides, no binding on the top or back edge, and they were relatively plain instruments. Now, currently, and for some years, they have been producing Style 15s. These are primarily guitars that are in the series of so-called technology series that originally had a bolt-on neck and now would have their so-called simple dovetail. So they're budget models, but made in the Nazareth, Pennsylvania factory. And they are of good quality, but they're not fancy. They are typically matte finish and very plain ornamentation, mahogany top, back, and sides, or these days, what Martin will say is select hardwood. There's sometimes substitutes for mahogany, such as sapele and a number of other tropical hardwoods that are sort of mahogany clones that look so much alike, it's hard to tell one from the other. But Martin, on the Style 15s today, does not specify that they must be what they call genuine mahogany. It can be other mahogany-like woods that look, feel, and sound just about the same. But they're good quality, not fancy, but and so far as custom, we've had some done in a variety of sizes ourselves that have been, including single O, double O, and triple O, and even a few quadruples. We've had them available in cutaway and non-cutaway, 12-fret neck with slotted peg head, and some with most with standard 14-fret neck. So quite a variety of different custom variations. Paul says, I have a 1969 Martin D18S guitars. The tuners are in closed boxes and have a screw hole pattern. I haven't been able to find among the Waverly catalog or other sources. Is there a chance to find replacements? Where to look? Those were tuners made by Grover, briefly used by Martin. The D18S would be a 12-fret slot head guitar with the extended length body. S used to be pre-World War II. What S meant was simply special. And it could mean just about anything, just like today, custom can mean virtually anything. It just means it's not a standard catalog model, but S meant special. But more recently, post-war, S typically means that it's a 12-fret neck on a model that otherwise would normally be a 14-fret version. So the D18S has the same extended length body as the D21 custom that I showed just a few minutes ago. That's pretty straightforward, but so far as the tuners, getting replacements for those particular Grovers, it would be easier to find a set of the old Grovers somewhere, or else you'll probably have to have somebody, if you want better tuners, frankly, there are better tuners than those, you may have to do a careful touch-up job and have somebody skilled. If you want to replace the tuners with something that is better, it's going to take a little bit of cosmetics to do it, but in the hands of the right technician, that job can be done very, very effectively. And so far as the quality of those particular enclosed box Grovers that were done only briefly, in my opinion, they're one of the least attractive tuners that Martin used quite a while, and they're not one of Grover's better quality endeavors. So, but if you can find a set, first find out what's wrong with the ones you have, because it may be that if they're slipping or not staying in tune, that there may be something that can be adjusted and repairable, but you're not going to find new ones like it, because that's a model tuner that was discontinued, and so far as I'm concerned, for good reason. David asks, besides the pick guard, what are the differences between a Martin O model and a Martin OM? Well, the OM model came out in late 1929, and the O's were around a lot longer, but the early O's were 12-fret slot head guitars. And those early 12-fret slot head O's had a 25.4 scale. It was their longer scale. And it was originally, when it first came out, the O was Martin's largest guitar. But later, obviously, the D was introduced, and it's bigger yet. But in 1934, what had been the OM model transformed to be called the new O, and the 12-fret O was discontinued. And but the OM model was 15 inches wide at the lower bout, just like a O. So on a modern O versus a modern OM, other than the fact that the OM typically is done with a smaller pick guard, the real difference is that the OM has always had a 25.4 scale, but the O in late 1934, when they went to using modern style frets instead of the bar frets, and stopped using just an ebony reinforcement in the neck and used a steel T-bar, they went to a 24.9 scale. So today, what's the difference between an O and an OM? Basically, it is scale. But if you also are doing a OM to the original specs, the OM has a 1 3/4 inch wide nut, which is pretty standard today for Martin O and OM. But the original OM had wider spacing at the bridge, whereas the new ones, unless you custom order, have the more modern, somewhat narrower spacing at the bridge. So the fact is, what's the difference right now between an OM and a O as standard catalog models for Martin? It's really, aside from the pick guard, the only physical difference in them is the scale length, which is a 1/2 inch longer on the OM. Both are good finger picking guitars, and it's going to be a matter of personal preference as to which you like. There are people who claim that that 1/2 inch makes all the difference in the world to them and the way the guitar feels. I don't personally find that. And the difference in length between nut to 12th fret is only half of that 1/2 inch, in other words, 1/4 inch. And that means that the actual difference in between first fret and second fret versus on an OM versus a O, it's a really tiny difference. And I think that even most good players really don't have a strong preference. I can tell you that I've sold OM guitars to Eric Clapton as well as triple O's. He likes them equally well. And the Eric Clapton triple O models have been very, very popular. But Eric himself, frequently enough, plays OMs and he's equally happy with them. He bought one of the Sinker model OMs from me last year, and he is very well pleased with it. So, and he's also bought vintage OMs from me. But the point is, both are very good guitars. But that's the difference. Greg Bolter asks, how does finish affect the tone? Everything on a guitar that you can think of just about affects tone. I mean, if you have one inlay pattern versus another, no, that doesn't. But pretty much anything you do structurally to a guitar does impact the sound. Type of wood, type of finish definitely matters. Martin guitars prior to 1926 were finished with French polish, which was a hand-rubbed shellac-based finish. And that's what is used on high-end classical guitars to this day. French polish requires considerable skill to apply, and in a factory setting, you can definitely spray lacquer and do finishes a heck of a lot quicker than you can do French polish, which was a big incentive for going to lacquer. For Martin in 1926, and Gibson started using lacquer a little earlier, but only by maybe 1 year, about 1925. But even there, their finishes didn't really go to a more modern looking lacquer until about 29 at Gibson. But fact remains that lacquer versus varnish versus French polish, it's different. And some of the early Gibsons are varnish finish. A lot of the early ones, in fact, prior to 1925, are a varnish, spirit varnish finish. And as spirit varnish and oil varnishes, guitar makers typically don't use oil varnish. It's too soft, but violin makers use oil varnish routinely on the finest ones. But on a violin, you don't touch anything that has finish on it. When you're playing it, your bow doesn't touch the body of the instrument. And if you have a shoulder rest and a chin rest, you don't touch the body. And the playing surface on the back of the neck on a violin is not varnished. There'll be a bit of varnish right on the scroll peghead, but the playing surface on the back of the neck is not varnished. And players don't want it to be either. It would feel good. Oil varnish would become rather tacky playing on it. And so basically on a violin, the varnish can be rather soft. It doesn't have to be very durable so far as rubbing on it, because you just don't do that. But guitar varnishes need to be more durable, and spirit varnish, which is alcohol-based, rather than oil-based as a solvent, can be considerably harder, and it does work well for guitars, but it's much more time-consuming than nitrocellulose lacquer. But also today, many instruments are made with polyurethane finishes, and there are techniques to spray poly finishes very, very thin, which can acoustically still sound good, but a thick poly finish definitely does not sound good. It's coating your guitar in a thick coat of plastic, and it's not a good thing for tone. But there are acoustic instruments that do sound good that have poly finishes, but they're thin. And then there are catalyzed varnishes that each type of finish has its own tone, but in general, thin finishes produce a more vibrantly alive acoustic sound. So a thick finish, regardless of what type finish it is, tends to dampen tone. So thin finishes are desirable, and they do help to protect the instrument. So it is a protective coating, but also a totally unfinished instrument, aside from the fact that it doesn't have any protective covering, tends to sound almost a bit harsh. But if you have a good quality finish, it can mellow it rather than just simply damping it. It can actually get rid of some harsh overtones and let through the good, mellow, nice overtones. So finish can enhance tone if it's done sufficiently thin and the right type finish. But there's considerable difference in the skill required to apply varnish versus French polish versus lacquer versus poly. And that is often reflected in what mass-produced guitars will have, especially if they're lower-end guitars, student models. They're not going to take as much time on the finishing, and finishing can take a lot of time. In many guitar factories, there's three basic departments. There's the white wood, there's the finishing, and there's the final assembly. White wood basically is building that guitar up to the point where it's ready to spray finish. It looks like a guitar. You could string it up and it would be playable without finish, but it wouldn't look as good. And finishing can take, for some instruments, just about as much time as the whole white wood assembly. It's a major expense for a guitar company to do good finishing. And in the case of final assembly department, that can also be a very significant part of the expense of building and assembling a guitar. Because in final assembly, that's where, aside from putting strings on it, it's already got frets on it. It's already had the lacquer sprayed on it. But if it's an electric, it doesn't yet have any of the electronics in it. It doesn't have the tailpiece. It doesn't have the tuners. It doesn't have the pickups. So you can end up where direct personal experience. I can tell you I was affiliated with Guild Guitars in Westerly, Rhode Island from mid-1984, early 84 actually, through the end of 88. And in doing some of their solid body electric guitars, and they did some models that were bolt-on, producing the neck and the body, even including whitewood and lacquering, cost less than final assembly, because final assembly had pickups. If you had, they were using a lot of EMG pickups, which were quite expensive at the time. They cost Guild close to $30 each, wholesale manufacture cost. And some of those guitars had either 2 or 3 pickups. And many of them had vibrato tailpieces. That was when Eddie Van Halen was popular, and everybody wanted a Floyd, or if they couldn't get a Floyd, a Kahler. And Floyd had an exclusive deal with Kramer, so you couldn't get a Floyd, you could get a Kahler tailpiece, but they were expensive. And then plus in final assembly, yes, they also include a case. Well, cases cost money. Point is, Guild's cost for 3 pickups, tuners, a Kahler trim, and a case could be fully as much as it cost them to produce the guitar in whitewood and whitewood and finishing combined were about the same cost to Guild as doing the final assembly, putting all those parts on. And if you're doing electric guitars and you don't have proprietary parts, then your guitar may sound about the same as everybody else's. So, Gibson had their own proprietary pickups, as did Gretsch, as did Fender. Guild did not. Guild was buying pickups. And they got a lot of DiMarzio pickups and a lot of EMG pickups. If you have EMGs or DiMarzios and tuners, but on a locking nut trem system, the tuners are not even, they don't have to be very good for that because your tuning's done at the bridge, but you still need tuners at the top just to put the strings on. And then by the time you get the case, the 3 pickups, and the Kaler tailpiece, you ended up spending as much for final assembly with the parts and labor of the final assembly department as you did for actually building the guitar all the way up to final assembly. There's a question from a guy named George. It's a name I can remember. I have a question about Gibson Artist series of electric guitars. Was their lack of popularity due to the inability to get the normal humbucking sound out of the pickups? How collectible are these guitars today? Well, Gibson made a number of artist models, and what distinguished them, we're not talking about artists by name. They made guitars for a variety of artists and have the artist's name. So they had a Trini Lopez model and a Les Paul models. That's not what we're talking about. This is a specific type of electronics. They were active electronics. They required a battery to power that. And the active electronics simply did not go over very well with most of Gibson's customers. R&B players just don't go for them. And so that's something that just didn't take off. They had an RD artist, and they also had RD models that did not have the artist active electronics. They had an ES artist, which looked somewhat like a fancier version of a 335, but it did not have any sound holes. It was still semi-hollow, like a 335, same size and shape. And it had 2 humbuckers, but the active electronics gave a different sound. And for the most part, R&B players, blues players, rock players just never did go for the sound of the active electronics on Gibson guitars. Now, I mentioned earlier that Gil did a lot of guitars with EMGs, and EMGs were active electronics. But the people who liked EMG pickups, it's a whole different concept. Gibson was doing these artist models back as early as 78. RD artist was 78 to 82. And the ES artist was similar time. That was early enough that heavy metal was not yet as prevalent, but heavy metal is one of the things that really helps put EMG in business. If you're running your electronics, the pickups, the guitar through rack-mounted digital effects, pedals, etc., the more you run it through, if you are modifying the tone so that the actual tone of the guitar might be rather with no electronic modification, might be a bit sterile techno pop, which is the way I view EMGs sounding. But if you're running it through a bunch of rack-mounted effects, that works great. You add the tones you want through your effects, but if there's any background noise at all, you want a very, very low noise to signal ratio. You want a strong signal and you want virtually no noise. And if you're running things through a whole bunch of looped effects, any background noise gets picked up and amplified at each step of the way. That's why EMGs were great, and a lot of heavy metal players who use lots of effects do like active electronics, but the RD artist and the ES artist Gibsons never took off. And today, they do not bring what I consider to be collectible grade prices. They will bring whatever they're useful for as a utility tool. If you like it, great, but you're not going to have to pay any collectible premium for it to get one of those. Typically, the RD artists, they look nice, but they well, they have nice ornamentation. It depends on what you consider looking nice. Their body shape, I think, is a little goofy, but they're still not bringing as much as a Les Paul. They cost a lot new, and they have not been a good investment as the years go by. And the same can be said of the ES artist. Kevin Lamb asked for an opinion on a Martin CEO8 model. The specs, it's a discontinued model. We've been asked about CEO8 and CEO7. The CEO7 was the size of a Martin 00. They started in 1997. They have an Adirondack spruce top, mahogany back and sides, Adirondack braces, ebony fingerboard and bridge, X-brace scalloped, modified V-neck. That's a nice guitar. So I think it's a nice guitar. Chris Martin has a good bit to do with that, which is why they're called CEO models. So just leave it at that for right now. Let's see, I'm going to come back. Terry says, I often see vintage Martin and Gibson acoustic guitars with repaired peghead brakes. What is the general market acceptance for these instruments? Well, I think the answer to that basically is that they typically will bring a very considerably lower price than a guitar that does not have a peghead brake. However, with skill, a peghead can be repaired really very well. And the fact is that from a utilitarian standpoint, if the peghead's been repaired properly, it can look remarkably good, and in some cases be virtually invisible. It can still be strong, and it depends so much on the skill of whoever repaired it. We have been successful in repairing some peghead brakes to the point where they look virtually perfect. And it's still going to keep a goodly percentage of its value, but so many peghead repairs are sloppy and often structurally poorly done, in which case your instrument is very considerably devalued. Sometimes they're strong, but incredibly sloppy, ugly work. And ugly brings less money. But if you're interested in getting great sound, you can't afford the price of one that is pristine. One that has a repaired peghead brake that was done skillfully can be a very good deal, because the guitar is going to bring at least a third less. And it may play absolutely fine. And if it's skillfully done, it's going to look fine. But if it's skillfully done, it may only go down 20% in value. And if it's not skillfully done, your guitar might be worth half price. So, but the point is, peghead brakes do not have to be death for the utility of a guitar. You can still have something that is just fine. Now, getting back to Kevin Lamb, who asked about the Martin CEO8, that's a guitar that has a body shape that is actually very much a takeoff on a Gibson J200. fact, here's a picture pulled up. You can see the kind of body shape that that has. To me, it just doesn't look like a Martin. The pick guard looks more like it's a takeoff on a Gibson. And the body shape, sure enough, looks like it. It's not one that I'm personally especially fond of. And I just don't think that it has much essence of Gibson to it. But at any rate, it is a guitar that is no longer in production. It's out of production. It's made to full standards of Martin quality. And I've seen them and thought they were interesting, but to me, just not essence of Martin, but that's a personal opinion. It certainly is a body size. It is not used on any standard model Martin today. Tom asks, after James DeQuisto went with Fender, was he the only luthier to make his guitars there, or were they being made by other luthiers at Fenders as well? I know that you have said that the best guitars were the last ones made by the individual luthier. Does this hold true for the Fender DeQuisto guitars? Well, Jimmy did not go to Fender and personally build guitars from scratch that were his models that he just made. He showed them what he wanted, and they built guitars to his specs. And there were a very limited number that were custom shop, handmade, that were remarkably good guitars that were made by Fender builders, and just there may have been 2 or 3 that Jimmy personally made that were just prototypes for them, but those were not catalog models for sale. So yeah, there was, in fact, I remember seeing one that was a custom that he personally made, but Fender didn't offer those in the catalog, and the number of those he made was like 1 or 2. But the rest of them, there were a limited number that were handmade in California, and then there were others that were production models that were made for Fender to hit to Jimmy's specs in Japan. And so any comments I made about the best instruments by an individual luthier, maybe some of his last, they would not apply to the factory-made Fender DeQuisto models. But Jimmy was severely epileptic, and he died actually of an epileptic seizure during one of his visits to work with Fender. He just went in his hotel room and went to bed and didn't get up. Had a seizure during the night. And unfortunately, during a grand mal seizure, you don't breathe. If it goes on long enough and you don't have medical help right there, you can die, which is what happened. But anyway, so far as the instruments, the DeQuisto model Fenders that you see on the market, with hardly any exceptions, those are things made in Asia. The number that were made hand-built acoustics that were done in California was very, very, very limited. And the number that he personally made from scratch were just a couple of prototypes that those were not offered for sale by Fender. Charles asks, was there a year or so in Gibson's past where one of their employees was putting the bridges on backwards on their acoustics and they shipped them to sell? It's a story I've heard. I've never heard this story. I do not believe it to be true. Now, Gibson has had on their acoustic guitars the so-called reverse belly body shape that looks almost backwards of a Martin shape. And on some that were made earlier, like during the war, they had some. World War II was the war I'm talking about. They had some that were shaped just like a Martin bridge. Now on electric guitars, it's perfectly possible to put a tunematic bridge on backwards. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of those might have slipped through, but quite honestly, they work either way. So that wouldn't really be a problem. If you didn't like the way it was, you could flip it around yourself. So that wouldn't be an issue. So, but on their acoustics, this question was specifically about their acoustics. I can't imagine any being shipped out with the bridges on backwards. It wouldn't fit. There's no way it wouldn't work. You couldn't do that. And so I think that that story makes no sense to me. But Stephen was asking about CEO8, and I already mentioned the specs on that model Martin. Jerry says, I've heard you mention something in recent Zoom webinars I took note of. I'm pretty much a fingerstyle guitar player. I've always liked and still like the feel and sound of dreadnought guitars. I play a Martin HD28 and an Epiphone FT110. In recent webinars, you mentioned that fingerstyle players more often prefer, for example, O or M series guitars marked by Martin or similar styles or models. Just for example, Gibson LOO, do you know of, or can you comment on why these types of guitars are more popular with fingerstyle players? Well, in general, a dreadnought-sized guitar is really designed for medium strings. They respond best with medium. They were designed primarily to be a flat-picking guitar. You can certainly fingerpick it, and some of the older dreadnoughts, as well as some of the new models, do sound good that way. But it's going to be a matter of personal preference. Hold one moment. I'm going to be right back. Hang on, please. I'm back. Hopefully you guys can see me fine. The picture on my screen has disappeared, but I can still talk, and let us know if you can see me. And if you can't, we'll work on that. But at any rate, so far as fingerpicking guitars versus flat picking guitars, there's no question you can fingerpick on a D, and you can fingerpick on a smaller guitar, or for that matter, the 12 fret Ds tend to have more sustain, and their balance and sustain feels different, and their string response feels different from a standard 14 fret D. An HD28 is sort of a classic bluegrass guitar, and they respond very well with medium action or even high action and just banging out loud bass runs. And you can certainly play lead too, but most of the players who use those are flat pickers. And if you get a 12 fret D, you'll find that it has more sustain, and it just feels completely different. Or if you try an OM or a OO, it feels different. Or a Gibson LOO size guitar for finger picking with a light touch, you can get, and light strings, they respond very differently from a D, and they are ideally suited for finger picking. And the only way I can describe that is to try it yourself and see. You will find that the feel is totally different. And many fingerpicking players prefer light strings. It also depends whether you're playing with picks or bare fingers. If you're using finger picks, the D may work pretty well. If you're playing bare fingers and you're playing softer, you can, with a light touch, actually get more volume on a OM or a triple O or a Gibson L double O than you might get on a large guitar. The large guitar responds very well with a pick and playing relatively loud. But you can actually, if you are doing bare fingers, you may get less volume out of that big guitar than if you're doing it on a smaller guitar. The smaller guitars have their own type response. And it doesn't necessarily also have to be small guitar, because, for example, the 12 fret D is not a small guitar. But the 12 fret D Martins are great fingerpicking guitars. And they do respond well to a rather light touch as well as to a heavier touch. So they feel different. They sound different. Their personality is different. So I'll leave it at that. You have to try them and see for yourself what suits you. Don asks, do you have any preference between bolted necks like Collings and Bourgeois versus non-bolted ones, Dovetail like Martin, or early Gibsons, or actually most Gibson acoustics would still have a Dovetail. And I think that so many factors go into sound that when you go from one maker to another, it's rarely that the guitars are identical except for the neck joint. Many of the acoustics that I really like in vintage all have dovetails, but Collings has a bolt-on neck. Taylors have necks that are not a dovetail. It is certainly easier to do a neck set on a Taylor. In fact, the Taylors are very specifically designed that if you have the right knowledge and you know what you're doing, you can take a neck in and out of a Taylor. So that 30 minutes later, you can have the neck out and back in and adjust the action. So that's something you can't do on a dovetail neck Martin, where you have hours of labor and you need a great deal of skill. But again, it's going to be personal preference on the maker, because when you get into Martin versus another maker, or any two makers, there's hardly ever a time when it's just the type of neck joint. There's too many other variables. He also asked about Torrified Wood, and I've said it so many times that I will just leave it off as it. My personal preference is for naturally aged wood. I consider the Torrified Wood not only to be physically more brittle, but I just feel that it has a harsher tone, and I prefer what I consider to be the more mellow and prettier sound that one gets with non-torrified, naturally aged wood. John P. says, if your toolbox includes a Tele, a Strat, a Les Paul, a 335, a hollow body Gibson Jazz box, a Martin in mahogany, and a Martin in rosewood, a classical guitar, a mandolin, and a P bass for kicks, where do you focus your attention for your next purchase? A Rickenbacker, question mark? Well, a Rickenbacker would certainly give you a different electric sound. If you want a different acoustic sound, nothing you mentioned here. When you say a hollow body Gibson Jazz box, by that, are you referring to a Gibson fully hollow, full depth electric guitar, or are you referring to a acoustic? Because that's two different animals. But if you want the complete selection, you'd get a hollow body, full depth Gibson or other maker of hollow body jazz guitar with designed with a cutaway and pickups. And then you'd also want a truly acoustic arch top, which is a whole different beast. And that acoustic arch top is something special and very different from anything you included. And one other thing that you did not include is a good resonator guitar. And you can have a resonator guitar designed for Hawaiian style playing with a bar slide, or you can have one that's designed so it's set up for bottleneck blues, or you can get a round neck one that's not necessarily just high action and open tuning for bottleneck, but you can get a resonator guitar like Paul Beard makes. It's a wonderful sounding, great playing, round neck standard guitar style, but with resonator, and that's a whole different sound. So if you want to round out the arsenal, that's the missing thing. So I'm not talking about brand name. You can get a variety of different brands of great arch tops, great flat tops, but what's missing and what you had mentioned was you get a full depth hollow body electric jazz guitar, a acoustic arch top guitar, and acoustic resonator guitar. And you could get a square neck one and a round neck one. The square neck for Hawaiian style or for bluegrass, and the round neck for blues and other playing, but they can be remarkably versatile instruments. Bill Worcester says, what is the current desirability level for 1970s era Martin D35 and D28 guitars? Well, they're not highly collectible, but they're good utility tools. In my opinion, they're not as good as the ones from the 60s, and they certainly don't bring as much money. The ones from the 60s featured Brazilian rosewood, and the ones from the 70s are Indian rosewood, Sitka spruce. In general, I consider the 70s to be one of Martin's least desirable periods, but Martin's least desirable is still pretty good. But by the 70s, you have to figure that not only have the specs changed since then, where the new ones are 1 3/4 inch nut width, different neck contour, they intonate more accurately. I think they're more attractive, just better guitars, but the new ones come with a lifetime warranty. And even if you get a recent one that doesn't have a lifetime warranty, it has more. Martin's improved their specs. Martin's building, I think, the best guitars they've done in the past 60 years right now. Not better than 1937, but I think they're way better than 1970. And 1970 now is 51 years ago. And that means also a lot of those 70s guitars are needing fretwork. They did not have an adjustable rod. Some of them, they didn't have, by the 70s, they didn't have a steel T-bar either. And those square tube rods they put in them in the 70s were not as stable as this T-bar. The T-bar with the tempered steel, what they're using in the Authentic series today, which duplicates what they did in the 30s, and is, by the way, the same rod that's in those Style 21s I showed you at the beginning of the hour. The T-bar is not adjustable, but it's very rare to see one of those necks warp. Those T-bars are very strong, but the 70s neck was not quite as strong. You end up sometimes with a goodly bit of work to take a 1970s guitar, even if it looks cosmetically good. You better check carefully that the neck angle is good, that the neck is in spec so far as neck relief, and otherwise you can end up with refretting and planing the board and resetting the neck and re-gluing the bridge and any loose braces, because the guitar is old enough from the 70s to start having geriatric issues, so that you can end up putting a goodly bit of work into it, and you may end up having a lot more money in it if you just bought the brand new one, which in my opinion is a better guitar. I don't view the 70s guitars as having collectible appeal. They're worth whatever they're worth as utility instruments. I see something. Mitch Holder a little bit ago says that the fellow who asked about the Gibson 50s Rancher may have meant the Gibson Ranger, which was meant an electric model. It was pictured as a conceptual representation, pictured in Rob Lawrence's Les Paul book, volume 1 on page 55. Conceptual means that they didn't actually make it. So I'll look that up, but you guys can look that up probably online as well. That's why we couldn't find the Gibson Rancher. The Gibson Ranger, so far as what do I think of it, well, if it's a conceptual representation, that basically means they drew a picture but didn't follow through on making it. So I don't have much of an opinion. Sal Holt asks, what is the current state of valuation for older American guitars for those who look to collect? Seems like they have been stagnant. Well, one could call it stagnant on some models. One might otherwise call it stable. They're not going down, and they are keeping up with inflation. Some have done better than that. We actually find that they're quite saleable. But it also depends on your definition of collect. If prices are stable, suppose you could buy a car and drive it for 300,000 miles, and it would retain its value and not go down. You'd be happy. It also wouldn't go obsolete. That would be really a great car. It doesn't go obsolete, doesn't wear out in your lifetime, and doesn't lose value. You'd be very happy. But if you're a speculator and you're buying them as an investment, the way one would buy stocks or bonds, if it doesn't go up in value, you're not happy. But in fact, the faster it goes up in value, the happier you are. But if you're a true collector, you're not buying them to sell. You're buying them because you really like them. And if they go up a little bit, that's good. If they go up 5% a year, you're happy enough. Because you're not really buying them with the intention of selling them anytime soon. You'll probably keep them as long as you are mentally and physically able to play, and they'll be sold after you're dead, or if you decide later in life that you're too arthritic to play or not having fun anymore, you may want to at least be able to get your money plus a little bit of interest on them over the years. But if they're going up, say, at 20% a year, or even briefly from 2002 through 2006, some electrics were going up where they were more than doubling, sometimes in 1 year. Les Paul Juniors went from about $3,500 to as much as $15,000 from the beginning of 2002 through the end of 2006. And well, that may be great if you're a speculator and you're planning on dumping them when it gets high enough, but it's not much fun if you're a collector, because what it really means is that you can make some money later on some that you've bought early in your collecting time, but you're going to be priced out of the market soon, and they're going to be so expensive that you won't be able to collect anymore, and then you won't have any fun. It's too rapid a price rise for a collector is actually not desirable. It prices them out of the market. So they spend all this time learning about instruments and studying them. And then in less than 10 years, they find they can no longer afford to collect anymore. That's not good. That's only good for speculators. And the problem is if the speculators bid the price up higher than the collectors are willing to pay, and more than any utility tool users are willing to pay, that means there's nobody left to buy them who wants to keep them. And once that happens, the market is destabilized and it's a bubble and it will pop. So if this is that 3,000-foot cliff and you go here, the utility tool users ended about here, they quit, that the collectors would go this far, and then it got so expensive that they could no longer afford it. They stopped, but there was still a profit, phantom profit out there, and the speculators were chasing the phantom profit. They went out here on the thin air, but that was a 3,000-foot drop here. And after about a year and a half, it goes beep, beep. The Roadrunner goes beep, beep, and it falls. And at any rate, right now, the guitar market is relatively stable on vintage instruments. Some models have gone up. Get the right Sunburst Les Paul, they're selling great. But many of these models actually are bringing less money right now than they did in late 06 or early 07. And if it's something like F5 Lloyd Loar signed mandolins that were $200,000 at the end of 06, now it's tough to get much over 100. They got bid up by speculators, and all the collectors and players who had them dropped out. And once the price got beyond 100,000, they were done. They didn't buy any. So depends again, what's the current state of valuation? I would say that guitars are not falling in value, that there is a pretty steady market from people who want to play them and some who actually enjoy collecting them and intend to keep them. Are there a bunch of speculators who are bidding prices up in a price war? No. Do I anticipate that it's going to change anytime soon on that? Not really. But I think that the market for really fine acoustic guitars is going to continue. The market for mandolins is less stable, perhaps, because it depends on bluegrass music primarily. The market for Gibson Mastertone banjos also is down right now for the pre-war models, some of the most sought after, because this bluegrass is perhaps not as strong as the moment. So at any rate, it's, I think that the market right now is actually reasonably healthy for guitars. The market for mandolins and banjos may be more iffy, but if you're a collector, you won't be bothered too much because really highly collectible good models are still obtainable and they are not currently falling. Whatever falling they did already has happened. It got bid up into a bubble. It was a correction. And at this point, they're actually relatively stable. Rich G says, I recently had an opportunity to buy a 1976 Martin D76. How does this guitar differ in construction and performance from other models of that era? Is the D76 highly sought after? Well, they made 1,976 of them, which they call the limited edition, but that wasn't very limited actually in terms of how many guitars Martin makes. They're not that big a company. And 1,976 is more D76s made in 1 year than they made of D28s in the whole pre-World War II period for making herringbone Ds. The D76 functionally does not sound especially different from either a D35 or a D28 of the same age. They were priced higher. They have star inlays on the fingerboard. they have a eagle inlay with a shield on the breast, on the inlay on the peg head. Looks to me like it's a Butterball turkey logo. But is it highly sought after right now? Well, the bicentennial is something that not that many people are collecting items from at this point. That happened in '76, the bicentennial of the USA, or at least of the Declaration of Independence. But it's a perfectly fine guitar, but is it a model that I find to be highly sought after or highly collectible? Not especially. But they do bring around $3,000. Jimmy Robbins says, I have a 1964 Gibson ES335 Cherry, bought new, and have a Bigsby bar. Was wondering if that will hurt the value. Well, if it came factory new with the Bigsby factory installed, it will still be less sought after by the majority of collectors than one that has the stop tailpiece. But still plenty good. If the Bigsby was added at a later date, it will hurt the value more significantly. But it still will be a very fine utility tool. If it has a factory installed Bigsby, we'll assume that it's the Bigsby that screws in at the end pin area and also with 2 screws into the top. And has the 2 roller bars. If it has the 1 roller bar, then you don't get much tension downward on the bridge. It doesn't really work as well. But if it has one of those, and I got it, the first thing I do would be to take it off. Because you can touch up the screw holes around the end pin area where the sunburst finish is pretty dark there. And just, you know, if it's already drilled for the stop tailpiece holes, put a stop tailpiece on it. It'll probably sound better and be more desirable. But without seeing your particular guitar, that's as much as I can easily say. Jerry Black asks, what is the advantage of a slotted peg head? Well, 1, they look neat. And 2, they give more tension downward on the nut, because on a standard peg head, I explained this previously, on a standard peg head, you have the string posts sticking up over the top of the peg head, the front of the peg head, and the break angle the strings go over the nut is considerably less than on a slotted peg head, in which the strings are recessed halfway into the neck, into the peg head. So that is considerably different. I've got a slotted peg head handy. Here is an example of a slotted peg head, and as you can see, the strings are recessed halfway into the peg head. So the break angle, you can see, over the nut is considerably different. On the other hand, this takes a bit longer to change strings. So some people complain that it's more trouble to change strings, although if you know what you're doing, the difference in time changing strings is really not that much. I like the looks of the slotted peg head, and I think that at least on a 12 fret neck, it looks great. Somehow to me, a 14 fret neck guitar doesn't look right with a slotted peg head. I know it's not traditional or whatever, but aside from whether it's traditional or not, it somehow just doesn't look right to me. So, but I do like slotted peg heads. I had somebody also ask about the proper strings to put on a 1960s Martin 0021. We did get that question asked, and in general, 0021 is a great finger picking guitar, and that's Ron Tobin. What gauge strings would you recommend for 1963 Martin model 0021? The answer is light gauge. And they're a marvelous finger picking guitar. Sound great with light strings. It could hold mediums, but it really just sings with light. Ted Silverman, in 30 years, notwithstanding the obvious inflation factor, do you foresee the value of higher end PRS electric guitars retaining value and selling for more than their already considerably high retail prices? Well, if you're asking about the price of 30 years from now, I have my standard answer, but you may not have seen my standard answer, so here's my standard answer. Let's look through the crystal ball and see what you see. And if you look through the crystal ball and you look at something that's held right up to it, like my watch, it's right side up and magnified, so you get a real good look of something right there. But if you look through it, see the stuff that's at a distance? It's all upside down. The world's turned upside down when viewed through the crystal ball. I have no idea what things are going to really bring in 30 years. I wish I knew. But I think folks who tell you what the stock market's going to be in 30 years are absolutely either delusional or just they got a bill of goods they're trying to sell you. Most stock pickers are thinking short term. Even Warren Buffett doesn't buy stocks for what they're going to be worth 30 years from now. I don't know what PRS guitars are going to cost in 30 years. What I have seen is so far, the PRS guitars that bring the most money are their earliest ones, the ones made like 1985 and early 86. And a lot of the high-end limited edition models by a variety of makers are things that don't necessarily seem to be great investments for long term. I tend to buy guitars that I think play well, sound good, are well built, and will have good market viability and will last a lifetime. They last longer than any person does. People come in, they'll have a picture of a guitar that mommy and daddy took when they bought it for them on their 12th birthday. They come in, now they're 75 or 80. The guitar looks just like it did in the picture and they're unrecognizable. But it's, the good ones give long-term pleasure, but if you're buying it for 30-year investment, I can tell you I didn't predict how much they'd go up in value from 2002 through 2006, and I'll be darned if I know what they're going to do in the next 30 years. But since I'm 75 years old, you're asking how much they're going to be worth when I'm 105. And I have no idea what guitars are going to be worth when I'm 105. I just hope that I get to be 105 and have good quality of life for that many years. That would be a great accomplishment. And I will very much like to do that, but I don't know that I can guarantee it. But in the meantime, I do anticipate that I'm going to make it through till next week, and hopefully long beyond that. So I'll look forward to seeing and talking with you folks next Friday at this same time. Until then, have a good one.